Did PTSD exist in the Old West? And if so, how much did it contribute to violence on the frontier? Well, first of all, yes, PTSD absolutely existed in the Old West, and in the East and the North and everywhere else where people have suffered trauma throughout history. Sadly, however, it wasn't until very recently that doctors kind of started figuring out how to treat it. Hell, back in the 19th century, there wasn't even a name for it, at least not officially. Instead of PTSD, they called it everything from the nervous heart to a soldier's heart, and if they really wanted to sound fancy, the Costa syndrome. You see, there was this army surgeon, Jacob da Costa, who noticed a lot of soldiers suffering from the same type of symptoms: heart palpitations, anxiety, tremors, emotional collapse, fatigue. But even then, they just sort of assumed that it was due to overexertion or physical strain, as opposed to a neurological disorder. And literally nobody received effective treatment. By the way, this was not just a problem on the frontier. There were millions of soldiers who served during the Civil War, and most of them did not head west after Lee's surrender. They just simply went back home and tried to put the past behind them. So while I'm sure that PTSD did exacerbate conditions on the frontier, which, don't worry, we will get to that in just a moment, in all reality, though, it was really more of a nationwide issue. Not only was there a big increase in alcoholism, with people just very understandably trying to self-medicate, but there was also a huge uptick in domestic violence. Or as historian Eric Dean put it, violence within the home became an outlet for many who could not escape the memories of battle. There was also a big increase in veterans being committed to insane asylums. By the year 1870, in just one institute alone, the Indiana Hospital for the Insane, veterans constituted somewhere between 15 and 25% of all male patients, with annual reports showing that they suffered from everything from mania to melancholia, and even what some called violent insanity. Similar patterns soon emerged nationwide, with many of the patients being described as being quote-unquote broken by Army service, and that they were prone to agitation and violence. So yeah, PTSD absolutely existed in the 19th century, no doubt about it. The only question is, how much did it contribute to violence or crime on the frontier? And by the way, before we dive into that, I do want to issue a very brief disclaimer. Anytime there's a discussion about violence in the Old West, there always seems to be two competing narratives. On one hand, there are those who think that shootouts were an everyday occurrence and that people were being gunned down left and right. And on the other hand, there are those who think that the West was relatively tame and that killings were extremely rare. Truth is, it just depended on the location. There was actually a really cool study out of Ohio State University. I'll drop a link down below. But one of the things they discovered is that, yes, while the Old West wasn't nearly as violent as they make it out to be in the movies, homicide rates were still extraordinarily high by modern standards, at least in the places they were able to study. Quote, "To appreciate how violent the West was, we need to consider not only the annual homicide rate, but the risk of being murdered over time. For instance, the adult residents of Dodge City faced a homicide rate of at least 165 per 100,000 adults per year, meaning that 0.165% of the population was murdered each year, between a fifth and a tenth of a percent. That may sound small, but it is large to a criminologist or an epidemiologist, because it means that an adult who lived in Dodge City from 1876 to 1885 faced at least a 1 in 61 chance of being murdered. 1.65% of the population was murdered in those 10 years. An adult who lived in San Francisco between 1850 and 1865 faced at least a 1 in 203 chance of being murdered. And in the other 8 counties in California that have been studied to date, at least a 1 in 72 chance. Even in Oregon, which had the lowest minimum rate yet discovered in the American West, 30 per 100,000 adults per year, an adult faced at least a 1 in 208 chance of being murdered. End of quote. Now, just to put that in perspective, the homicide rate for Chicago just last year in 2024 was 21.5 per 100,000. So even in Oregon in the 1880s, which had the lowest homicide rate out of all the locations studied, you had a higher chance of being murdered there than you would in present-day Chicago. I just wanted to toss that out there because I will invariably hear from someone trying to tell me that violence in the Old West was just an invention of Hollywood. And to be fair, in a lot of places it was pretty tame. There were a lot of Mayberries out west. But at the same time, there were also places like Dodge City or Tombstone or even Deadwood that were much more violent than comparable cities back east, or even much more violent to cities nowadays in the United States. Okay, so now that we've got that established, let's go ahead and take a look at what caused the violence and whether or not PTSD was a contributing factor. Now, this next part is going to sound a little crazy, but believe it or not, a lot of historians think that it was a lack of women on the frontier that fueled much of the violence. Turns out transient communities, made up almost entirely of young men, tend to be a little prone to stuff like alcohol abuse and status competitions, both of which oftentimes result in violence. By contrast, your more established communities back east, with stable families and churches and long-term social ties, they just had more social restraints on that type of behavior. They also had a much lower tolerance for settling disputes at the point of a gun. Then there's the lack of adequate law enforcement out west. We talked about this recently on the Bounty Hunter episode. I know we like to think of people being really hard on crime back in the old days, but the truth is, many of those sheriffs and town marshals, they were just as crooked as the outlaws they were supposed to be arresting. And the courts, well, they were notorious about letting criminals off with a mere slap on the wrist. And hell, in some places, there wasn't any law to speak of other than what a man could enforce with his own two hands. And finally, ethnicity and class also played a role. I mean, think about it. You had whites and Hispanics fighting along the border. There was violence against the Chinese pretty much everywhere. Almost constant clashes between the settlers and the indigenous. And there were a ton of labor disputes involving everyone from miners to railroad workers and sometimes even cowboys. Toss in the fact that many of these Western migrants brought with them an honor culture where all slights, both real and perceived, were answered swiftly and violently. And yeah, you had a recipe for disaster, even without PTSD. I don't doubt that PTSD played a role. It had to have. But I do think it was more of a contributing factor rather than the root cause. In other words, trauma didn't light the fire, but it almost certainly poured gasoline on it. So just to sum things up, not only did PTSD exist in the Old West, but it affected thousands of people long before anyone had the language or tools to help treat it. As far as the frontier, though, it was already a pressure cooker even prior to the Civil War. All that violence wasn't caused by just one single factor. It was more of a result of all the stuff combined that we already discussed. The alcohol, the honor culture, the lack of adequate law enforcement, the mostly male transient population that lacked the calming effects of a family or social ties. All of that stuff collided in the same place at the same time, and that's where much of the violence came from. Did PTSD play a role? Probably, but it certainly wasn't the only factor. Now, what you just heard was in response to a question from listener Isaac over on YouTube, who asked, do you think PTSD from the Civil War and the amount of directionless soldiers returning home is a big factor in the presence of the rougher elements of the post-war West? Great question, Isaac, and I hope I at least somewhat answered it. I know I can get a little rambly at times, but yeah, I thought it was a pretty interesting question and thought I'd give it a stab. Now, if you don't mind, I would like to answer a few more listener-submitted questions and comments, but first, just one more quick word on PTSD. I'm always hesitant to talk about this kind of stuff because I've never been in the military. I've never been to war. I've never been shot at. I've never had to see one of my buddies blown up. Nothing like that. But I am very close to people who have. My own father did a tour in Vietnam as a medic with the 25th Infantry, and he's on disability right now due to PTSD. Likewise for a lot of my friends and family who served in Iraq and Afghanistan. This shit's no joke. I've seen firsthand how deeply it can affect people, and it is very, very difficult, if not impossible, to manage on your own, especially this time of the year. I know the holidays are meant to be festive and everyone's jumping up and down and singing Christmas carols, but if you're suffering from something like PTSD, it's not always easy to put on a brave face. So if that's you and you're struggling, I just want you to know that there are options available. If you're a veteran, you can always reach out to the National Center for PTSD or the Veterans Crisis Line by dialing 988 and pressing 1. That's 988 followed by the number 1. And even if you're not a veteran, you can still call 988 for the Crisis Lifeline. It's available to anyone, anytime, no matter what you're going through. You do not have to carry this weight alone. Asking for help is not a weakness, it's survival. And you know damn well you wouldn't have made it this far if you weren't a survivor. Okay, I'll get off my high horse now. I just thought it was worth mentioning, and yeah, let's go ahead and answer some questions from the audience. Listener CK wants to know if there's any type of connection between Doc Scurlock and Brushy Bill Roberts. Brushy Bill is too good/fun to be true, I agree. However, I find it interesting that Doc Scurlock was in Eastland, Granbury, Claiborne, and Vernon, Texas, which is not too far from Hyco, Texas. Could Brushy Bill have met Doc, picking up some inside info to carry out his hoax? Great question, CK, and this is something that other people have also brought up. But here's the thing. Brushy didn't move to Hyco until long after Doc Scurlock was already dead. For the vast majority of his life, I'm talking from the mid-1880s all the way up until after 1940, Brushy resided in Northeast Texas. There's like this tiny little triangle of Gregg County, Van Zant County, and Hopkins County, and that's where he spent almost the entirety of his life, except for a couple of short stints up in Arkansas. However, that said, there was a point in time, a period of about 7 years, when Brushy and Doc did live in a very close proximity to one another. This would have been from like around 1912 all the way to 1919, when Scurlock was living in the town of Maybank and Brushy was in Van Zant County. But did they ever actually brush shoulders? Who knows? I'll tell you this much though, Scurlock wasn't really big on talking about his past. Matter of fact, it was while he was living there in Maybank that a reporter tried to interview him, and he just flat out refused to talk. Would he have been as equally as hesitant to speak with a cotton farmer, roughly half his age, like Brushy Bill Roberts? I'm going to lean towards probably, but once again, nobody can say for certain. Now, as far as Brushy having insider information, I am going to push back on that just a little bit. I know this is a very common misconception, but I can assure you that Brushy had no special inside knowledge about anything that wasn't already available to the public. Everything that man ever said in regard to Billy the Kid, he either got from books or from his very own active imagination. Keep in mind that by the time he started telling his stories, there were already movies about Billy the Kid, not to mention a ton of books. Pat Garrett, Walter Noble Burns, Emerson Huff, Miguel Otero, George Coe, Charlie Siringo. These are just a few of the people who published books about Billy the Kid prior to the 1940s. And many of these books are still used by modern historians. So it's not like Brushy was living in the dark ages. He had a lot of great resources at his disposal. Now, this next little bit was not part of CK's question, and I don't want to put words in the man's mouth, but there are some people, not CK, but there are some people who will look at something like Doc and Brushy living in close proximity to one another and jump to the conclusion that Doc purposely moved to Maybank just so he could be closer to his old pal Billy the Kid. There's really nothing I can say to people who think like that. They're going to believe whatever they want to believe, and they're not really interested in the actual history so much as they are in these fantastical stories with no bearing in reality. But yes, to answer your question, they did at one point live very close to one another, but that said, there's no evidence whatsoever that they met or spoke or anything like that. And Brushy definitely did not have any insider information. So thank you, CK, for the question. Next, we got Doug coming in with another question regarding Billy and Brushy. In Brushy's version, some guy left a gun for him in the outhouse, but he never went and got it. He says he hit the jailer over the head and took his gun. So was there ever a gun reported found in the outhouse? Now, what Doug's referring to here is when Billy escaped from jail over at Lincoln. And the short answer is no. There was never any reports of a gun being discovered in the outhouse. The long answer, in case anyone's curious, is that we still do not know, even to this day, how Billy got his hands on that pistol that he used to kill Deputy Bell. I don't care what anyone tells you. I don't care how confident they sound. At this point in time, we just don't know for certain. Now, the theory that he got the gun from the outhouse, that was first made popular by historian Maurice Fulton. According to Mr. Fulton, the pistol was, quote, planted in the privy in the courthouse yard by a boy who lived nearby. He then goes on to write that one of Billy's friends, Sam Corbett, quote, contrived to slip a piece of paper into the kid's hand without being observed by Ollinger or Bell. It bore but one word, privy, but Billy understood the message, end of quote. So according to Fulton, it was kind of like what you see in Young Guns 2, only instead of Jane Greathouse passing the note, it was Sam Corbett. Problem is, though, Fulton never listed his sources. And there's also other versions of the story that I do think are just as plausible. According to Pat Garrett, Billy got the pistol from the armory. And according to Billy's friend, John Meadows, who supposedly got the information from Billy himself, he took the gun from Bell after a brief tussle there on the staircase. And then you got Walter Noble Burns, who claimed that Billy got it when he and Bell were upstairs playing poker. So at the end of the day, nobody can say for certain. All we know for sure is that Billy at some point got his hands on a gun and Bell wound up dead. He may have gotten it from the outhouse, or he may have taken it from Bell after bashing him in the head with his shackles. But to answer your question, no, there was never a pistol found in the outhouse following Billy's escape. That's just Brushy Bill getting his stories mixed up. Okay, one more Brushy Bill related comment, and we'll go ahead and move on to something else. Afer Z4P says, Brushy Bill Roberts got a 93% photo fit with the Billy the Kid photo. This is quite a chunk of evidence. Considering the hurried early morning burial of a body some claim was Billy the Kid and others claimed it wasn't, to me, after listening to Brushy Roberts' tapes, he had more in-depth evidence in his testimony than other written books about the kid. What's more, they all checked out as correct, factual to the scenes others knew little. Okay, well, I do appreciate the comment, but unfortunately, it does look like you've been misled on a number of points. Now, that 93% photo match that you're referencing, that study was conducted at the University of Texas in 1990. If you go to the Wikipedia page for Brushy Bill Roberts, there's a whole paragraph on it, and it is incorrect. I've actually spoken with the men who conducted the study, Professors Acton and Bovick, and they are both adamant that not only were the results misconstrued, but that there was not a match whatsoever. In fact, they told me flat out that they do not believe that Brushy Bill Roberts was Billy the Kid and that they were intentionally misquoted. I'm not going to say who misquoted them, but you can probably figure it out. Now, both of these professors did decline to appear here on the show. I'm hoping to interview them for my book. Fingers crossed that they say yes. But you don't just have to take my word for it. These guys are still out there. They're still active. And it took me about 5 minutes to locate an email address via Google. So if you want to, you can ask them for yourself and see what they have to say. As far as Billy having a rushed funeral, I'm not really sure what you're basing that on. I mean, they literally held a public wake for the man. And by the way, it wasn't Garrett or even his deputies who buried Billy. It was the citizens of Fort Sumner. And not a single one of them ever said anything about the body not being Billy the Kid. This is a really important distinction because this is one of those lies that gets tossed around the internet all the time, and it is 100% false. There were a lot of eyewitnesses, and some of them actually saw the kid's body when it was still warm. Others attended the wake and helped to prepare the body for burial, and every single one of them, without exception, said that Pat Garrett killed Billy the Kid. I just can't say it any plainer than that. And I'm not trying to pick on you, man. I know you've probably heard this from other sources, but there is not a single person who was at Fort Sumner on July 14th, 1881, who ever said that they buried a different body or that Billy the Kid escaped or that Pat killed the wrong man or whatever. It just didn't happen. Now, just to circle back to the whole photo comparison thing, there have been similar studies. I know recently there was a NYPD forensics detective who supposedly claimed that Billy and Brushy were a match. But as tends to be the case, all you gotta do is dig just a little bit deeper and you'll see that it's much ado about nothing. For instance, that forensics detective that I just mentioned, I'm not gonna say his name. I don't want to put the dude on blast here publicly, but he does have his own channel on YouTube. And I'm gonna go ahead and read the disclaimer that he posted under a video about Billy the Kid. Verbatim. All right, here we go. These are his words, not mine. My opinions are my own and do not reflect the opinions of my employer. This project was for entertainment purposes only and was originally explained to be a genealogy project of subjects I had no knowledge of. I was not paid for the photo analysis done. A possible match does not mean it is a positive match. It is simply a belief or hypothesis based on experience and training. And this next part is in all caps. This was in no way a full investigation. I was given multiple photos, but not all available photos. Comparing historical photos is not the same as identifying live criminals against a repository. My employer's practices do not include one-to-one photo comparison. No facial recognition technology of any kind was used in the comparison of the photos. My beliefs are based solely on my experience. Now, why is this important? Well, I think a lot of the times when people hear about forensics detectives, especially ones working for prestigious outfits like the NYPD, they just automatically assume that they're using some type of fancy spy equipment or special software. And as you can see from that disclaimer, nothing could be further from the truth. Dude flat out admitted that all he did was eyeball the photos. That's it. No software, no computers, nothing. But you know what? I will take him at his word that he's acting in good faith and that he truly believes that Billy and Brushy are a possible match. But unfortunately, bad actors do exist. Not necessarily this particular detective. I'm not accusing him of anything. But there are people out there who will verify a photo of your grandmother and say that she was Billy the Kid if you pay him enough money. There's another forensics expert who's done work on Billy the Kid related projects, as well as huge criminal trials. And this guy has literally been found liable by a court of law for fabricating evidence. Hell, the state of Connecticut had to pay out over $25 million due to this guy's supposed forensics helping to send an innocent person to prison. Point I'm trying to make is that these guys ain't exactly batting 100. There's a reason why Brushy Bill proponents rely on these shady forensics as opposed to actual historical evidence, and that's due to literally all of the historical evidence showing that Pat Garrett killed Billy the Kid. All of it. We might be at a point one of these days where there's some type of software or maybe even artificial intelligence that can scan those old tintypes and verify a match. But despite what you might read online, we're just not there yet, and it does not exist. Okay, Tin Man 00 wants to know if I have any stories about Washington State. I have covered a few topics that took place in Washington, most recently with John Tornow. Not exactly my proudest episode. I feel like I kind of rushed that one a little too much. I also did a series on Harry Tracy, and a good deal of his story takes place in Washington. And that may be it. I really can't think of anything else off the top of my head, but hey man, if you got some suggestions, I am all ears. I also have really big ears, coincidentally. I know there's a few conflicts that I would like to cover that took place in Washington, like the Whitman Massacre and the Rogue River War. I just got to find time to sit down and put in the work. But yeah, there is a lot of great history up there, and I do look forward to learning more about it. Okay, next up, we got an email from Jake. Dear Josh, I am a fan of your show going on a couple of years now, and I'm reaching out for a couple of things. An episode suggestion and a request for some writing advice. As said, I've been a fan of your show for a couple of years now, and it's truly a highlight of every week. Now, I'm from Montana, and I've always loved the tales of Sheriff Henry Plummer and the Montana vigilantes that hung him. I'm sure you're busy with plenty of other episodes at the moment, but I'd be happy to hear an episode on what I consider one of the most interesting groups of figures and events from the Old West. A good source to consider on this would be a book titled A Decent Orderly Lynching by Frederick Allen. Hope this topic catches your interest and eventually the interest of other listeners. Now on to the writing advice. I decided to start creative writing as a hobby a few months ago, and I'm having fun creating a fantasy setting that essentially boils down to cowboys with swords. I just published my very first short story in a local Montana sci-fi fantasy magazine that I'm also starting up with some friends on campus that I attend up in Montana. As I try to pursue writing some more, one of the pieces of advice I've gotten the most is to do a lot of reading in the genres you write in. In my case, that would be both westerns and fantasy. Here's where I'd like your advice. Though I've read a handful of books in those categories, I actually haven't read a long list of either westerns or fantasy books, or even watched many westerns, or even watched many movies in those genres. A lot of my ideas for stories so far have been inspired by real people and events, which has been fun to do, but I feel like I'm missing out on important storytelling aspects. I'd love your opinion on what books or movies in the Western genre I should start reading and watching. I'm open to any suggestions you can think of, and I would also welcome any other advice you might have. Well, Jake, first off, thank you, by the way. And you will be happy to know that I do own a copy of the book you mentioned, A Decent Orderly Lynching, and I am very excited to cover Plummer at some point, hopefully in the near future. But just like with everything else, it's just a matter of time. But yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to that one. You know, Plummer and the Vigilantes, that's one of those stories I feel like I should have already covered a long time ago. I almost feel like it's foundational to Old West history. And yeah, we need to go ahead and tackle that one. You were absolutely right. As far as the advice about what to read, I'd probably start with some of the classics, you know, authors like Elmer Kelton and Zane Grey, maybe some Louis L'Amour. And the good thing about a lot of these classics, many of them have already been adapted into movies. Everything from The Searchers to The Shootist to Little Big Man, The Assassination of Jesse James. These were all novels before they became movies. Now, this is not going to shock anyone who already knows me, but if you only read one book, I would highly recommend Lonesome Dove. It is, in my opinion, the greatest story ever told. You might also consider checking out some books by Cormac McCarthy, like Blood Meridian or All the Pretty Horses. As far as movies, once again, it's hard to go wrong with the classics, right? There's a reason why The Searchers is consistently ranked as one of the greatest westerns of all time. I personally think it's a little overrated, but it's certainly worth checking out. You might also watch The Unforgiven or Open Range, Outlaw Josie Wells, Jeremiah Johnson. Hell, you might even watch Young Guns 1 and 2. Those are all great movies. They're not all that accurate, but they are great movies. Other than that, man, just keep on writing. I think you said you just started, so I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but in a few years, you're going to look back at everything you're writing right now, and you're going to be amazed at how horrible it is. And that's okay. That's just part of the process. That's like the price of admission. You can only get better by doing the thing, so just keep doing it. Write every single day. Keep a journal or 2 journals or 3 journals. Find writing prompts to sort of get the juices flowing. Just keep coming back, even when you fail, even when you don't feel like it, and eventually you're going to be where you want to be. And please, if you ever get anything else published, just let me know and I'll share it with the audience. Speaking of the audience, how's that for a segue? Okay, let me just make one final announcement and I'll let you get back to enjoying the rest of your festivities. This will be the last time you hear from me in 2025. But don't worry, we will be starting things back up either the first or second week of January. First with the Life and Times, John Henry Doc Holliday, and then we're going to slide on into that series on Wyatt Earp. So with that in mind, from the bottom of my heart, I just want to say thank you for sticking with me throughout 2025. It's been a hell of a year, man. It wasn't always easy. I know a lot of people have had a really hard time of it with the economy, and people are out of work, people are having a hard time finding a job. But if you're hearing my voice right now, or if you have the misfortune of looking at my face, that means you made it through. We all made it through, so here's hoping that in 2026, everything will be coming up roses. I think this is finally going to be our year. So I want to wish you and yours a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Enjoy the eggnog, enjoy the mistletoe, and until next time, until next year, adios.